24-year-old Gina Allen and her brand new boyfriend, 28-year-old Brandon Day, could not believe their luck. For the past 48 hours, they had been stranded in the rugged wilderness of the San Jacinto mountain range in California when they looked down into this ravine and they saw a campsite. There was a tarp that had been strung up between two trees. And so they ran over to it, hoping that the owner of this campsite would be in there and they could help them get out of these mountains. But when they got to the campsite, there wasn't anyone there. But from the looks of it, it looked like someone had been living in this site fairly recently. Underneath this makeshift roof from this tarp was a sleeping pad, there was a warm sweater, there was shoes, there was a disposable razor, some kitchen utensils, and there was a yellow backpack. Without any hesitation, Brandon and Gina, who were totally famished and they're exhausted and they're desperate, they just start rifling through the different things in camp, hoping to find some things that will help save their life, like a cell phone or a radio, or even just a lighter or some matches or some food. And so Brandon focused on all the items that are just kind of laying out under the tarp, and Gina focused on the contents of the yellow backpack. And so Gina, she opens up this backpack and she starts pulling out all these maps that are inside. And she notices on the margins of these maps, in the white space, there is handwriting, and it's done in pen, and it looks like it's been written fairly recently. Now, at first, she didn't read any of the notes that were on these margins. She was just kind of pulling them out and stacking them on the ground next to her and continuing to rummage through this bag. But at some point, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed on the top map that was sitting on the ground next to her, there was a particular note at the top of the page that as soon as she saw it, she stopped what she was doing, she turned and looked at it. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in fact, she didn't want to get her hopes up, but she slowly reached over, she picked the map up, and she put it right in front of her face, and as soon as she was reading it, she just started laughing. She was so happy, she was so relieved, she yelled to Brandon to come over and look at this. And so Brandon stopped what he was doing, he turned around, and he bent down, and he looked exactly where she was looking, and when he read what she had read, he started laughing too. They were saved. There, at the top of this map, there was a note that was dated the same date as the day they were there, May 8th. And so they knew whoever had written this had written it at least in the last couple of hours because it was May 8th, and so they had to be around here somewhere. And so Gina and Brandon, they stand up and they start yelling out for the owner of this camp to please come out and help them. But in their excitement, Brandon and Gina had overlooked a critical detail in this note. And it would turn out that critical detail would change their lives and the life of the man who owned this camp forever. Before Brandon and Gina ever began their doomed hike into the San Jacinto mountain range, another man, one which neither of them knew, was gearing up for a hike of his own that would take him through the San Jacinto mountain range. His name was John Donovan, and on April 19th, 2005, which was the day he would begin this journey, he was 59 years old. John had absolutely no family. He was born an only child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had been orphaned and basically had to raise himself from that point onward. By the time John was in his 20s, he had moved to Virginia, where he had taken a job as a social worker. And despite making a fairly decent salary, he refused to spend any more money than he absolutely had to. It was a habit he had developed as an orphan child, trying to make ends meet with virtually no money whatsoever, and as an adult, that habit just never left him. So as a result, for his entire life, all the way up until he left for that hike in 2005, he never had anything nice. He basically wore the exact same outfit virtually every single day. He never owned a car, he never owned a phone, he never owned a computer, and when it came to where he chose to live, he would always live in the most absurdly cheap dwellings possible, which included at one point living in a partially burned down, abandoned savings bank with no heat. John was a proud Irish Catholic, he drank lots of whiskey, he swore like a sailor, and he had no problem speaking his mind no matter who he was talking to. While he was a lovely person once you got to meet him, his unorthodox lifestyle and his at times gruff exterior made it pretty difficult for him to make friends for most of his life. But when he was in his 40s, he wanted to lose some weight, and so he decided to join a hiking club. And to his surprise, the other members of this hiking club adored him. They thought he was hysterical, and he made being out on the trails so much more fun and enjoyable. And before long, all these members of this club became John's family that he never had. And so John would go on every single trip this hiking club went on, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him in his life. When it came to hiking, though, John was a bit of an anomaly. Even though he would hike sometimes over 4,000 miles in any given year, he would still routinely get lost on trails he had been on dozens and dozens of times. But despite being totally self-aware of this fatal flaw in his hiking abilities, John rarely did anything to compensate for it. For example, he didn't bring with him on most hikes a compass, which would be the first thing you would think to bring with you to stay oriented. Also, because he refused to buy a phone, he didn't have that to aid him either if he ever got lost. In fact, John rarely brought much of anything on any hike he went on, because John is what you would call a ultralight backpacker, which basically meant you would only pack the absolute bare essentials, and in John's case, sometimes less than the absolute bare essentials. And despite his friends trying repeatedly to get him to pack more equipment so he was more prepared, he would always say no, he knows what he's doing and everything is good. And the truth is, John always did manage to get from point A to point B on all of his hikes, some of which included extremely difficult hikes, like the time he hiked the 500-mile-long Colorado Trail, or the time he hiked the 2,175-mile-long Appalachian Trail. Now, John would tell you that was all skill, but his friends would say John was extremely lucky. He would get lost, and then at the last second he would find the trail again, or he would lose some piece of critical equipment, and then just someone on the trail would happen to walk by that had an extra set of whatever it was that John needed. And then one time when John was in Poland on a hike, he slipped on this icy embankment where earlier that day, 2 other hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides. He's flailing. He can't stop himself. And then the drawstring on his pants gets caught up in a tree, and that arrests his fall and it saves his life. And so from that point on, John would only wear those pants when he went hiking, and he called them his lucky pants. In the spring of 2005, John and one of his very close hiking friends named Ken Baker, who was roughly his age, decided they were going to hike the 2,650-mile-long Pacific Crest Trail. This trail spanned the entire west coast of the United States. It starts in Southern California, right on the border of Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington State, right on the border of Canada. It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. He had actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, "I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not." And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker. His coworkers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California all alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Padgett, and asked him, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto mountain range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter, and statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto mountain range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain, it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto mountain range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto mountain range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to your death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near two other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm. It was a 46-year-old nurse from Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge, but was still several miles away, three very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, "Hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like?" And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of this storm, and we have all the right gear. You should really consider turning around and leaving. But these three hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the three men that had told him not to go eventually just said, okay, good luck. And they carried on down the trail, and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them, and when he gets up close, he can see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, "You know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you." But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own and he would go up to Fuller Ridge and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats and allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge. And if John was going to continue like he said he would up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge, so best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge, but by that point the snow was practically blinding, and so at this point John decided, you know what, I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below, he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow, he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours, he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals. And finally, he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley, where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. If he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those, and his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in, and so he was boxed in. He was trapped, and he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night. The next morning, when the sun came up, John attempted to make a fire, but none of the wood he was finding was dry enough, so all of his fires just kind of smoldered but didn't really catch. He had a mirror, a signal mirror, and he was prepared to flag down any aircraft that flew overhead, but no aircraft did, so he didn't flag anyone down. And so by the end of that night, he was back under his tarp, having made no progress, settling in for another freezing cold, sleepless night. The next morning, when the sun finally came up again, John was totally disheartened, and he decided to start jotting notes down on the margins of his map, which was the only place he had space to write. He figured he would keep a sort of diary. That way, if he didn't get out of here, someone would figure out what happened to him. And so his first entry was that day, May 5th, and he wrote that his friend Ken was right. He should have postponed this trip by 3 weeks and avoided the bad weather. Ken was the smart one. And also in this May 5th entry, he took an inventory of his food supply. He said he only had 12 cheese crackers left. And then on May 8th, John wrote a note that said, took a fall, too weak to climb out of canyon, down is a gorge, no way out. This was the message that Gina and Brandon discovered when they stumbled on this campsite. But the significance of this note was not literally what he wrote, but rather when he wrote it. On May 6th, Brandon Day and his girlfriend, Gina Allen, were in Palm Springs for a business convention. Brandon was a financial advisor, and so he was out here for business, and Gina was his guest, so she was really just vacationing. And so towards the end of the convention, when Brandon had some free time, he and Gina decided to leave the hotel and go on a hike somewhere. And so they actually linked up with a tour group that was leaving the hotel, that was heading over to this tram station, where they were going to take a tram car all the way up to the top of the San Jacinto mountain range. A tram car is basically like a ski lift, except once you ride it to the top of the mountain, you don't do any skiing, you just do sightseeing. And so Brandon and Gina, they get to this tram car, they hop inside, they get to the top, and it's totally amazing, beautiful view, there's snow at the top, and they're told they have about 20 or 30 minutes before their group is going to take the tram car back down again. And so Brandon and Gina decide to kind of venture off away from the main group and have some alone time before they leave again. And as they kind of venture off, they start to hear what sounds like a waterfall. And so the two of them are kind of looking around, asking if they can see it or if they know where it is, and they don't. And so they say, hey, do you want to just leave the trail and walk towards this waterfall? It can't be far. It sounds like it's only maybe a couple of minutes away. We'll take some pictures, we'll come back, and then we'll catch the tram back down again. And so they decide this is a great idea. They leave the path and they start walking towards the sound of this waterfall. But after walking for a pretty significant distance, they realize the sound of this waterfall is not getting any closer. It seems to actually just be getting farther and farther away. And what they didn't know was happening was the sound of the waterfall was actually echoing off the walls of this mountain. It was basically playing a trick on them. The acoustics made it seem like it was really close, but really it wasn't. It was pretty far away. And so by the time they finally did locate this waterfall, they knew they had ventured fairly far off the main trail, and they really needed to hustle to get back up to the tram station to meet their group and catch that last car out. And so they took a couple of pictures of this waterfall and then quickly turned around and began booking it back towards the station. But on their return trip, which they believed they were going in the right direction, they started hearing the sound of voices coming from the tram station, but they were coming from a different direction. And so Gina and Brandon stopped and they're thinking, I think we got to go this way, but clearly that's the sound of the other people in our group coming from that direction. And so they decide to follow the sound of the voices. But just like the sound of the waterfall, the sound of the voices were not coming from that direction. That was just an echo bouncing off the walls. It was basically a trick the mountain was playing on Brandon and Gina. And so they start walking in the wrong direction, and after walking for quite a while and not getting anywhere nearer the tram station, the voices just finally stop. And they look at their watches and they realize they missed the cutoff. They missed the last tram. All those tourists they were with, they've left. They are now alone somewhere out in the middle of the mountains. But they did not panic. They figured, you know what? We'll just make our way to the tram station and we'll either catch the next tram or, maybe there's a payphone or something up there we can use and, we'll figure it out. Now, it's important to mention that Brandon and Gina did not expect to spend very much time out in the elements. They expected to get on a tram, stay at the top of this tram station with a bunch of other tourists where there was a restaurant and a bar, and then they were going to ride that tram car back down and be back at their hotel before dinner time. As such, they didn't bring any supplies. They didn't even have their cell phones. They had left those in the hotel room because they wanted to make sure they were focused on each other. And so all they had were the clothes on their back, which were very light. They had tank tops and some sweatpants on. They each had a very light jacket as well. And they had a wallet and some chapstick. They had no water. They had no food. And so Brandon and Gina, they begin walking around in search of this tram station. And for several hours, despite their best efforts, they don't find it. And then before long, the sun is going down and the temperature is dropping rapidly. And so eventually, after it becomes too dark to continue to move around, the couple winds up going into a cave where they huddle up all night, barely avoiding becoming hypothermic. The next day, when the sun comes up, they haven't slept at all, they climb out of their cave, and they continue walking around the mountain in hopes they find this tram station. But eventually, they get to one of the higher points of the area they were in, and they have a pretty good vantage point around them, and when they start looking out, they don't see the tram station, they don't see anything but wilderness in all directions. And so they decided their best bet was just to walk straight down the mountain and try to just walk off the mountain. And they figured as they began walking down the mountain that the tour guide had probably recognized they were short 2 people the day before, and so certainly a search had been launched and there were people looking for them, and probably they would be found long before they ever had to actually walk off this mountain. But little did they know, their tour guide that had brought them onto the tram and then brought that group down, they had recognized they were short 2 people, but they assumed those 2 people must have just taken an earlier tram, and so nothing was reported. Nobody was looking for them. And so all day, Brandon and Gina made their way down this very steep mountain, falling half the time, smashing into rocks and trees, and getting cut up on manzanita bushes. It was just this awful experience, and by the time the sun was going down, they had no sense of how close they were to the bottom. They didn't have a good viewpoint. They were just kind of trapped inside of the wilderness. And so once again, they huddled up for the entire night. This time they didn't have a cave to protect them from the wind. And so it was just another absolutely miserable night. And so finally the sun comes up on the 3rd day, and Brandon and Gina, they're up and they are moving straight down this hill. They want to get out of there as soon as they can. And after smashing into more boulders and more trees and getting more banged up, they finally arrive at the same drop off down into a ravine in Long Valley that John had gotten to. And so they're standing over this ravine debating whether they should make the leap and jump down into this ravine, even though it means they can't climb out again. As they're looking around, they're figuring, you know what, we don't really have a better choice. We don't really have the energy to climb all the way up and try to go a different way, and we don't even know if those ways are more advantageous. And so just like John, they turn around onto their stomachs, they grip the top of this drop-off, and then slip down into the ravine. Once they stand back up, they start walking down this ravine and they spot a river, and they run over to the river and they drink as much water as they possibly can. And it's a huge morale booster. And then they get back up again and they're continuing walking down the stream when off in the distance, they notice a green tarp strung up between trees. It was John's campsite. And so Brandon and Gina, they run over to this campsite and they eventually come across John's notes on the margins of his maps. But after standing up and yelling out for this owner to please come out here and help us, we need your help, we're lost, and then no one came out of the woods, no one heard them, no one responded, Brandon went back to the note and he looked at it again, and that's when he noticed it. The note had been written on May 8th. However, it had been written on May 8th, 2005. The year that Brandon and Gina were reading it was 2006. So this note was 1 year old. John had just happened to get lost and write a note on the exact same calendar day that Gina and Brandon arrived at his campsite and discovered the note. In their initial excitement and joy that they might get saved, they did not pick up on that year discrepancy. The couple began looking more closely at all of the gear underneath the tarp, and they noticed all of the metal objects like the forks and spoons and the pots and the pans, they were all starting to rust, and some of the other objects like the shoes looked like they had been sitting in the same spot for a really long time. They both started to get a really bad feeling about this campsite, like something terrible had happened there. Gina emptied the yellow backpack's contents onto the ground, and that's when they found a wallet. They opened it up and they pulled out an ID card, and it was John Donovan's ID card. So now they knew who had written the note and who owned this camp. Afterwards, Gina and Brandon laid out all of the maps to see if there were other messages that they had not read yet. And there were. There were 2 other additional messages after the May 8th message. On May 11th, John said he was celebrating his 60th birthday and that unfortunately he was down to his last 2 cheese crackers. And then in his final message on May 14th, John wrote, "Headed down to creek for water. Goodbye. Love you all." Devastated, the couple knew what they were reading were almost certainly John's last words, and his body was most likely somewhere around here. And then it dawned on the couple that if John, who seemed like an experienced hiker who had all this gear, if he had gotten trapped and died out here, then how did they stand any chance with no experience and no equipment? And so not knowing what else to do, Gina just rounded up all of John's things, she stuffed them into his yellow backpack, and then she shouldered the pack, and then she and Brandon just walked away from John's campsite and continued walking downhill, hoping that up ahead there was not going to be some gorge like John had mentioned in his May 8th note. But unfortunately, after walking for a little while, they reached that cliff with the 100-foot drop, with the waterfall going off the side of it, and they realized that they were trapped, same as John. There was nothing they could do. And so totally speechless and shocked, they just both sat down, they didn't look at each other, and they just sat there wondering what was going to happen next. And they both were thinking, this could be the place where I die. At some point, Gina kind of snapped out of her trance and she took John's backpack and she began rifling through it, pulling everything out all over again. And Brandon asked her, what are you doing? And she said, well, maybe there's something in here that we missed. Maybe there's a secret pocket or something in here that could help us. And so she rifles through this bag, and sure enough, she finds inside of a small pocket in the bottom of the bag was another bag, a little plastic bag, and inside of it were matches, and they were still dry. And so immediately the couple pull them out and they start to round up logs to try to make a fire, and as soon as they light it, it doesn't catch because all the logs in the area that were on the ground were wet from previous snowstorms and rainstorms. And so all night they tried lighting these fires, but they all just kind of smoldered out. And so eventually, after the sun went down, Gina and Brandon, who were totally disheartened, they went back up to John's campsite and they went under his tarp and they huddled together for another freezing cold night. The next morning, Brandon woke up because he actually did fall asleep, and Gina was still sleeping. And so Brandon decided to just leave the tarp and go out and get a breath of fresh air. He knew they were in a terrible position, but he just wanted to clear his head. So he stood up and he could barely stand. He was so achy and tired and he was so hungry, and he decided he would just walk down to the edge of this cliff and look out into the valley to see if maybe there was a way down. And so he walked along the river, stopping periodically to get a sip of water until he got to the very edge. And when he got there, he looked down and he saw something that he had not seen the day before. There, in a pool of water all the way down 100 feet down, was a body lying face down in a pool of water. And that body belonged to John Donovan. Brandon was too far away to actually confirm if that really was John, but he instantly knew. But instead of being scared or saddened or depressed by the sight, it kind of invigorated Brandon and reminded him that if he doesn't act, he and Gina were going to die too. And so Brandon decided he wasn't going to set some small campfire to try to signal someone. He was going to try to light the entire forest on fire. And so he walked back up to the campsite and he got the matches out from the backpack, and then he walked into the forest a ways that was right near the river and near their campsite, and he found this tree that was obviously dead, and he walked around gathering as much dry wood as he could, and he propped it up against this dead tree, and then he put as much kindling as he possibly could into this hole in the trunk of this dead tree. And after doing all this prep work, he got his matches out and he lit some of the kindling, and to his surprise, the tree caught on fire almost immediately. In fact, it burned so quickly and so big that Brandon had to run away so that he didn't catch on fire. And before long, all these trees are catching on fire, and he had to run all the way back to the campsite and wake Gina up. And so he grabs Gina, they get up, and they run all the way over to the edge of the waterfall, and they turn, and they're just watching half an acre just completely erupt in flames. And all this black smoke is billowing up into the sky. And then about an hour later, after the fire had eventually just kind of died out on its own, Gina and Brandon heard the distant rumblings of a helicopter. They had seen the smoke and they were coming to rescue them. Gina and Brandon would be airlifted out of the ravine and would make full recoveries. John Donovan's body would be recovered 3 weeks later. His cause of death could not be determined. Some say that final note he left on May 14th, where he said he was going down to the creek to get water and then said goodbye, I love you all, that was sort of a suicide note, that he actually threw himself off that cliff to end his suffering. Others say he just walked down to the edge of this waterfall and was trying to get a drink of water from the creek when he slipped and then fell over the edge to his death. But we'll never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that in 2005, when John Donovan was still alive and missing, had he been rescued, he would have left the valley with all of his supplies, including those matches, which would have meant in 2006, when Brandon and Gina found themselves in that ravine, there wouldn't have been a way to start that fire, and so they would have died. In fact, the helicopter pilot that did come up and rescue Brandon and Gina, he would say there was nobody planning to search that area. This was not an area they believed Brandon and Gina would be. And so it really was only because of that fire that those two lived. As such, the couple said they owe their lives entirely to John Donovan and his unbelievable sacrifice. On July 11th, 2006, a funeral was held for John in Virginia. 80 people showed up for it. Most of them were his hiking friends from his club. After the service was over, they all kind of poured out onto the cemetery lawn around John's gravesite, and as the bagpipes played Amazing Grace, Lynn Paget, the man who had done the first 100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail with John before his feet swelled up and he had to leave, he walked around the crowd handing out red Solo cups filled with a tiny bit of John's favorite whiskey. And then after making sure all of the adults had their drinks, Lynn went to the head of his very good friend's grave and he delivered a beautiful eulogy. In it, he tells the crowd that he thinks of John all the time, he misses him terribly, and at night he has the same dream. He's walking down this trail next to a stream, and then the stream bends off to the side, and as soon as he walks around the bend, he sees this green tarp. And he knows it's going to be John, and so he yells, hey comrade, hey comrade. And as he's walking over to the tarp, he realizes John isn't there. All it is a tarp, a pack, and some shoes on a rock. As for Brandon and Gina, they did stay a couple after the ordeal, but they would ultimately break up 2 years later. Reggie Cole was just a child when his family moved from Louisiana to an area of Los Angeles, California called South Central. When the Coles arrived in 1985, South Central, which had a population of 500,000 people, was seeing a huge uptick in gang violence and drug dealing. But by the time Reggie, the youngest of the 5 Cole children, had turned 10 years old, the family had managed to move from an apartment on 98th Street in one of the most dangerous areas of South Central to 71st Street, one of the few somewhat safe neighborhoods in the area. They lived in a small tan bungalow that had a neat front yard that was bordered by rose bushes and shaded by palm and eucalyptus trees. Reggie's mother was a deeply religious woman. She made sure all of her children attended the local Missionary Baptist church every Sunday. She was also strict and told her 2 daughters and 3 sons that they had to be inside the house every night before the streetlights came on. Reggie's stepfather, who had raised the Cole kids as if they were his own, worked in an aluminum factory. He was from a small town in Louisiana, and in their new South Central neighborhood, he became known for his soul food. On Sundays, the Cole children always looked forward to a big meal of red beans, rice, black-eyed peas, and collards. But for one of the Cole children, the middle son named Kenny, home was not on 71st Street. For him, home was the old neighborhood where the family had lived on 98th Street, where Kenny was part of a violent gang called 9 Deuce Hoover Crips. And when Kenny was 15 and Reggie was 10, Kenny was killed in that old neighborhood in a drive-by shooting. His killer was never caught. Reggie was devastated. Always small and skinny, he had idolized his older brother, and Kenny had always protected Reggie from neighborhood bullies. For a while after the murder of his brother, Reggie continued to do well in school. He got good marks in junior high and joined his other brother as an usher in church on Sundays, and he kept up with school social events, playing basketball and attending his junior high prom. But by the time Reggie was 2 years into high school, all that had changed. Reggie, who had inherited his deceased brother's friends and gang affiliations from the old neighborhood, was gradually sinking deeper and deeper into gang life. Because of his goofy attitude, Reggie became known to his brother's friends as Gumby. Although he still lived at home with his mom, Reggie had moved out of her house and into a shed in her backyard. His family called him Reggie, but now he preferred his street name, Gumby. And he'd started dressing down, which meant wearing the oversized jogging suits and sports apparel and expensive sneakers that marked him as a gang member. Then, in his senior year, he dropped out of high school, and at the same time, his mom and stepfather separated. Once he was out of school, Reggie spent all of his time on the streets, or in his shed, where the walls were covered with gang graffiti and where he now grew 2 marijuana plants right outside the shed door. The gulf between Reggie's life and that of his siblings and mother also continued to grow. One of Reggie's older sisters was a bus driver and a choir director at the Missionary Baptist Church. His other sister had just enrolled in college, and Reggie's older brother was a hospital equipment operator. Reggie's brother-in-law had offered him work in his plumbing business, but Reggie wasn't interested. He always drifted back to his gang in the old neighborhood. So it was a huge disappointment to his mom, but not exactly unexpected, when Reggie, at the age of 16, had his first arrest after failing to stop for a police officer, and his second arrest later that same year for getting caught carrying a weapon. A year after that, in 1993, when Reggie was 17, the homicide rate in South Central had skyrocketed to the point where 7 people were being killed there every week. And Reggie was at ground zero for all of that street violence, selling crack at motels along the Figueroa corridor. Running 30 miles north and south through the city, Figueroa is one of the longest streets in Los Angeles, and today it has the highest arrest rate in the city for prostitution. Finally, in 1995, when Reggie was 19, his gang affiliations and his criminal behavior caught up with him. On August 1st of that year, Reggie was found guilty of fatally shooting a man who was standing outside of a known prostitution house on Figueroa Street. Reggie was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Immediately after the sentence was read, Reggie was placed in a holding cell at a county supermax facility in South Central until a prison transport bus could take him to his new home 3.5 hours away in Imperial County. That new home was Calipatria State Prison, one of the most violent maximum security prisons in the California correctional system. A few days later, on the day Reggie was set to leave for Calipatria, he was thin and lanky, standing at almost 6 feet tall, but weighing just 140 pounds. He was also still wearing the orange jumpsuit he'd been wearing in county jail. Only now, as he climbed onto the prison transport bus in leg and ankle chains, the orange suit marked him as a brand new prisoner, or fresh fish, in the eyes of the level 4 offenders he would be spending the rest of his life with in Calipatria. As the bus headed east from the county jail in Los Angeles and crossed from the heart of the city into the desert, Reggie began to realize just how bad his situation really was. He was not just traveling to a new jail, he was leaving behind everyone and everything he had ever known. About 3 hours later, while looking out the window of the bus, Reggie got his first glimpse of Calipatria Prison off in the distance. Its sprawling 325-acre complex of fences, towers, exercise pens, and 2-story cell blocks sat in the middle of more than 1,200 acres of sandy, desolate no man's land. As Reggie sat there staring, he suddenly realized he was soaked with sweat, despite the fact that the bus was running its air conditioning on full blast. But Reggie had no idea how comfortable that bus ride was relative to where he was going. In Calipatria Prison, when inmates were sent outside to the asphalt-covered exercise yard, there was almost no shade, and temperatures routinely reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the height of summer, temperatures could reach as high as 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And winters in Calipatria were actually just as bad as the summers, but for the opposite reason. During those months, temperatures would plunge well below freezing at night. As the bus rambled down the road, getting closer and closer to Calipatria, Reggie started to smell the cow manure from the cattle feedlots they were passing by. Reggie bent his head down toward his shackled hands to try to cover his nose, not realizing that there was absolutely no getting away from that smell. It would literally permeate every inch of his new home. Finally, the bus reached the prison. Before entering the prison grounds, the bus had to pass through a heavily guarded and fortified opening in a 13-foot-high electric fence topped with razor wire that outlined the perimeter of the maximum security area of Calipatria. The purpose of this fence, which had enough voltage in it to instantly kill anyone who touched it, was to cut down on prison escapes, and to allow correctional officers, who were outnumbered more than 50-1 by prisoners, to move from guarding the perimeter to patrolling the inside of the prison. However, this shift in manpower had done very little to stop the violence inside the prison. There was hardly anyone in California, including Reggie, who hadn't heard news reports about the horrible attack that had happened in Calipatria 3 months earlier. 5 inmates armed with homemade knives stabbed and beat 8 prison guards. None of the guards died, but the incident sent shockwaves through the state. After passing through the perimeter fence, Reggie's bus continued on towards the main prison. As they got closer, Reggie suddenly felt scared and wished the bus ride could go on for a little bit longer so he wouldn't have to get off. The bus finally reached a large garage just off of one of the main buildings. When the bus pulled into the garage, the inmates saw several guards standing around inside, clearly waiting for them. And behind these guards on the wall was a big security door that led into the prison. It actually went into an area called Receiving and Discharge, or R&D. R&D is where new inmates are cataloged, inventoried, and booked into the prison system and their specific prison facility. The bus driver pulled into the designated parking spot in the garage and then came to a complete stop. As the bus engine idled and Reggie and all of the other fresh fish sat anxiously on the bus, one of the guards outside, who was carrying a clipboard, stepped onto the bus and chatted with the driver for a moment. Then the guard turned and faced Reggie and the other men on board and started calling out their names one by one. As he did, each man got up and, with their hands and feet in shackles, they shuffled to the back of the bus, where another guard had opened the back door. There, they would walk down 2 steps to the garage floor. The guard at the back of the bus would then yell at them to make their way over to the door that led into R&D, and there, standing outside that door, were several more guards, all armed with pepper spray and batons, who would pat each man down and search them. After the men were searched, they were motioned to walk through the door into R&D. Although the chains and shackles he was wearing had already drilled into Reggie the fact that his life was now totally changed, he was still not prepared for the shock he felt when he finally stepped through the R&D door and was actually inside the prison. Inside, a guard watched every move Reggie made, and security glass and wire separated Reggie from the men and women who processed his paperwork. What little he had brought with him was about to be inventoried and put into a storage compartment. His only possessions going forward would be the items that prison officials would give him over the next several hours. After stepping into a big windowless room, he was told to take off his clothes, and then a guard with gloves on did the first of hundreds of strip searches that would become a routine part of Reggie's life. Then he was handed his prison-issue clothing and told to get dressed. After he was given his inmate ID card that he would keep with him at all times. Reggie was also given 2 blankets, 2 sheets, a washcloth, a pillowcase, soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. After leaving R&D, Reggie was walked to his cell. In Calipatria, the cell blocks were all 2 stories high, with each cell door facing out toward a common area that the guards patrolled. Unlike what most people imagine when they think of jail cells, these cells did not have bars with lots of openings to look through. The cell walls were concrete, with no windows, and the doors were heavy sheet metal with only 2 small vertical slits that were windows that they could look through out into the common area. Inside of Calipatria, every sound reverberated off of the concrete and metal, meaning it was always noisy and extremely difficult to sleep. As Reggie was led by the guard to his cell, the awful sounds echoing all around of people yelling and banging on things were so distracting and awful that his initial impulse was just to run away to somewhere that was quiet. But, of course, as soon as he had that impulse, he remembered that he'll never be able to do that, ever. This was his reality. When Reggie finally entered his single-person cell and heard the door shut behind him, he felt himself relax just a little bit. He looked around his tiny room and saw a metal sink and a toilet, as well as a bunk bed. And as he looked at the bunk bed, it took him a second to process that there was another person laying on it. Although Calipatria had only opened 3 years earlier in 1992, by the time Reggie arrived, it was already completely overcrowded, which is why single-person cells like this one now held 2 people. The man laying in the bottom bunk stared at Reggie. Reggie looked away. He knew better than to try to be friends with this man. Keeping his head down and making sure he did not touch the lower bunk where his cellmate was still watching him, Reggie awkwardly made up the top bunk with the sheet and blankets he'd been given in R&D. Then, once his bed was made, Reggie walked a few feet over to the metal toilet. He did his business. Then, without a word, he hauled himself up onto the top bunk, where he lay staring at the ceiling in silence. Within the first few weeks of Reggie's arrival, he was given his first lesson in prison survival. He was out in the exercise yard when an older inmate who was sitting on top of one of the picnic tables motioned Reggie over. With his elbows propped on his knees, the inmate stared at Reggie as if sizing him up. Then he told Reggie, "You need to find people from your neighborhood, and then you need to join one of the gangs, and if possible, you join the same gang that you ran with on the outside. And don't trust anyone. No one here is your friend. Oh, and make yourself a knife." Reggie thanked him and decided he would take his advice. Inside the prison, Reggie began scanning the inmates for tattoos that signified they were in the Crips, like he had been when he was still a free man. Outside in the yard, Reggie continued to scan the inmates, but he kept to the perimeter where he couldn't be seen as disrespecting anyone or invading their space. Reggie also always carried a homemade knife, which was a toothbrush he had filed down against the concrete. But before Reggie was invited to join a gang, which would offer him protection, he was challenged. Reggie had been making his usual perimeter walk out in the yard when a bigger inmate and a few of his crew walked over and stood in front of Reggie, blocking his path. Then the main guy started muscling Reggie against the fence. Reggie already knew what happened to fresh fish who did not stand up to the first sign of any kind of disrespect or aggression. In fact, he'd seen it over and over again right in his own cell. His cellmate, the same one who had been laying on the bottom bunk when Reggie first arrived, had made the mistake of thinking a few visitors to their cell, men neither of them knew, were there as friends. His cellmate had welcomed them inside and shook hands with them, while Reggie had remained on the top bunk and pretended to be asleep. The men who had come inside immediately grabbed Reggie's cellmate, threw him on the ground, and raped him. When they were done, they left without touching Reggie. Because Reggie's cellmate had not fought back during this first assault, these men would come back many more times, and each time Reggie would be forced to listen to it while he lay still and silent in his top bunk. And like most of the inmate-on-inmate attacks at this prison, the rapes went unreported. Even if a guard took a charge like that seriously, the consequences of snitching on another inmate were much worse than any punishment a correctional guard could deal out. So, out in the yard, as Reggie found himself being muscled against the fence by this big guy, the thought of his cellmate being raped over and over again ran through Reggie's mind. He knew he had to stand up for himself. So Reggie reached into his waistband, he grabbed his homemade knife, and he stabbed the bigger inmate in the side. His aim was not to deliver a wound that would kill, or be so serious that the guards would have to investigate, but to use his weapon for defense and intimidation. From that day forward, while Reggie would never be known as a brawler, he did start to build a reputation as someone who was quick to use his blade, and therefore someone who was not to be messed with. Shortly after this stabbing, Reggie was welcomed into a gang called the 49 Deuce Crips. All the Crips at Calipatria were run by a single man, one of the most violent inmates there, a 200-pound bodybuilder named Eddie Clark, who went by the nickname El Diablo, or the Devil. For El Diablo, Calipatria was not just his home, it was his business. Calipatria was known as a money prison, where drugs were just as pervasive as unchecked violence. Reggie had seen dozens of inmates smuggle crack and heroin around the prison. They would put the drugs inside balloons before inserting them into their bodies, a practice that was extremely risky because the balloon could break or disintegrate once it was inside of them. And all this was part of the drug empire that was ruled by El Diablo. Even the guards recognized his power as Calipatria's shot caller, allowing him to wear a bright orange do-rag wrapped around his head out in the prison yard. Under the general protection of his new gang and their leader, El Diablo, Reggie's life got noticeably better. Not only was he now much more safe at the prison, but being a part of this gang also allowed Reggie to feel somewhat human again, whether it was playing basketball or leaning up against the picnic tables and chatting with fellow gang members. Reggie finally had people around him that he felt like he could trust. But, like everyone else in the Deuce Crips, Reggie did his best not to interact with or attract any attention from El Diablo. Because even though El Diablo was their boss and main protector, they were all afraid of him. El Diablo was only 34 years old, but he had spent 20 of those years behind bars. When he was a juvenile, he beat another teenager to death. When he was an adult, he sexually assaulted an elderly woman and shot her son in the course of robbing their house. In prison, El Diablo was known to turn on people, even his own people, suddenly, viciously, and without warning. The devil was also connected to prison staff. 2 years after he'd entered prison, he'd fallen in love with one of the corrections officers who oversaw one of the common areas where the devil spent time. He wrote her an 8-page-long love letter where he told her that, quote, she had 75% of his heart. This was apparently enough for Lisa Finch, who eventually quit her job as a prison guard, married El Diablo, and on her visits to him in Calipatria, she smuggled in PCP-laced cigarettes that he could sell to other inmates. Over the next 4 years, Reggie carved out a relatively safe life for himself in Calipatria. He had managed to fit in with his new gang without upsetting El Diablo. He also managed to avoid making any real enemies outside of his gang. Over the course of those 4 years, Reggie spent much of his time exercising, which added some muscle to his thin frame. He also got several tattoos, including a Ghetto Star prison tattoo on his shoulders, as well as 2 Crips tattoos on his chest and stomach. But despite settling into a routine and starting to feel relatively comfortable, Reggie knew he and everyone else at that prison had a big problem. By 2000, so 5 years into Reggie's prison sentence, El Diablo had gone from just being a very intimidating inmate to being a monster. He would attack virtually anyone for virtually anything. Sometimes all it took was looking at him wrong to get stabbed or beaten or raped. This, of course, made life inside of the prison even more precarious than it already was, as no one knew who El Diablo's next target was going to be. By the fall of 2000, the devil, who was now manufacturing alcohol from the fruit juice he stole from the prison kitchens, had developed such a substance abuse problem that some of his own fellow gang members had tried, unsuccessfully, to stage an intervention. As one inmate recalled, when he was drunk, he was an animal. If he raped you, nobody was going to say anything. But it would turn out that out of all the violent and dangerous offenders in Calipatria who might have stood up to El Diablo and challenged his authority, it would be Reggie, one of the least ruthless inmates, who would finally do it. In late October of that year, an inmate using a slingshot fired a homemade dart at one of the corrections officers out in the prison yard. The dart missed and stuck into a gatepost instead. Immediately, the guards ordered all the inmates to lay on the ground so they could do a weapons check to see who had thrown the dart. The guards didn't discover who had thrown it. However, during their search, they did find a homemade knife inside of a cotton glove laying out in the grass. The guards didn't know this, but the knife belonged to El Diablo's cellmate, who was one of El Diablo's most trusted lieutenants. And so as the guards picked up the knife and began asking whose it was, every inmate in the yard knew El Diablo was going to do something to protect his cellmate from getting caught. El Diablo's eyes traveled across the yard and came to a stop on Reggie Cole, who just happened to be out on work assignment painting one of the prison walls that faced into the yard. Reggie was already serving a life sentence without parole, so adding a weapons charge wouldn't actually change his sentence. Paintbrush in hand, Reggie held his breath, but even with his eyes down, he could feel El Diablo's sudden attention and the silence that filled the yard. Reggie looked up and saw the devil staring right at him. Then El Diablo made a single motion with his hand, pointing to the knife in the corrections officer's hand. He might as well have shouted his order. "You, Reggie, you take the blame for this." For just a moment, Reggie's mind went blank. Then he saw in his mind what would happen if he agreed to do this for the devil. He might be sent to solitary confinement. He might have his family visitation rights revoked. And he would be publicly submitting to another inmate which would make him look weak. And if he agreed to submit this one time, then he'd likely spend the rest of his life at Calipatria under the thumb of other inmates. So, with El Diablo staring at him expectantly, Reggie paused and then said the words that changed the course of his and El Diablo's life. "No, not my knife," Reggie said. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the corrections officers looked stunned. Reggie did not look at El Diablo, but both men knew at that moment Reggie was now a marked man. El Diablo would make sure that Reggie paid the highest price possible for refusing this direct order. Over the next 4 weeks, Reggie expected to be attacked by El Diablo or one of his henchmen at any moment. As the nights grew colder, Reggie would lie in his bunk, sleepless, thinking about his options. The way he saw it, there were only 4 of them. He could submit to El Diablo and do whatever he wanted to pay for his insubordination. He could snitch on El Diablo to the guards. He could kill El Diablo, or he could be killed by El Diablo. Reggie obsessed over these 4 choices. He'd pace around the perimeter of the exercise yard, keeping a very wide berth around El Diablo, weighing out the pros and cons of each action. Finally, Reggie made up his mind. He didn't know exactly how it was going to happen, but he knew he'd be ready when the time was right. It all happened on the morning of November 28, 2000, roughly 1 month after Reggie had refused to take the blame for the knife. That day, Reggie was walking around the perimeter of the exercise yard when he noticed the devil walking toward him. The devil wasn't even trying to sneak up on Reggie. It seemed like he wanted Reggie to know that he was about to get attacked. Reggie stopped and just watched the devil as he got closer, not really sure what he should do. When the devil was finally right in front of him, he didn't say anything. He just reached out and grabbed Reggie's shoulder with his left hand, and then with his right, he drove a knife into Reggie's side. Not far enough to be a lethal blow, but enough to send a very painful message that Reggie's days were numbered. As he pulled the knife out of Reggie, El Diablo leaned forward and whispered into Reggie's ear, "You are my bitch." And then he chucked the knife onto the grass and casually walked away. Reggie pressed his hand over his wound, he gritted his teeth, and he walked in the opposite direction of El Diablo over towards the fence. There was nothing anyone could do for him. The guards made no sign of having even noticed the attack, and even if they had, Reggie, like other victims of El Diablo's violence, would have lied. About 15 minutes later, a bell sounded, signaling the exercise period was over. The guards and inmates knew the drill. The inmates would line up and be searched for weapons or contraband before they were allowed to re-enter the cell blocks. El Diablo was ahead of Reggie in the line. Reggie, hiding his stab wound under the waistband of his pants, stood there quietly, clutching a 6-inch-long knife that he had dug out of its hiding place near the fence just minutes after he had been attacked by El Diablo. A corrections officer ordered El Diablo to turn around while he was still in line and to stretch out his arms so he could be searched. The devil did this, and as he was turned around, he stared menacingly at Reggie. On the devil's right forearm, there was a tattoo of a hand gripping a sword. On his right ribcage was a self-portrait of El Diablo slitting a man's throat. Looking up and finally meeting El Diablo's eyes, Reggie suddenly leapt over the crouched prison guard who was between them searching El Diablo, and Reggie drove the point of his homemade knife directly into the front of El Diablo's throat. El Diablo, still staring at Reggie, but now with a look of terror on his face, staggered backwards and off to the side. The blade had gone straight through his voice box, and blood was now pouring out of that 1-inch hole in the center of his neck. Reggie immediately threw himself to the ground, putting his hands behind his back. As he laid there looking up at the stunned El Diablo, Reggie knew the wound he had just inflicted was fatal. As everyone else in the yard also got down on the ground and guards started firing off their cans of pepper spray, Reggie told one of the nearby guards, "I know what I did. I know what I did." By the time the doctor arrived 30 minutes later, El Diablo was dead. By late that afternoon, Reggie had been placed into solitary confinement. Other inmates may have hated and feared El Diablo, but by killing Calipatria's shot caller, El Diablo's lieutenants would be gunning for Reggie. Not only that, Reggie now faced another murder charge. If he was convicted, the only punishment left was the death penalty. And no one contested the fact that Reggie had committed this murder. There had been dozens of eyewitnesses, including prison guards, who had seen Reggie fatally stab El Diablo. Also, there was security camera footage, and there was Reggie's own confession, one that he never tried to recant. Instead, Reggie actually went on record saying that he felt bad for killing El Diablo because El Diablo was a human being who had a family that was going to hurt when they heard the news. But Reggie also insisted that he murdered El Diablo in self-defense. If a judge accepted this, the first-degree murder charge would be dropped to manslaughter and Reggie would escape the death penalty, but he would still face 10 years in solitary confinement. Both outcomes seemed so grim that even to Reggie, hiring a lawyer and preparing a defense seemed both hopeless and pointless. When Reggie was handed a list of county-approved attorneys, he looked at it, but none of the names meant anything to him. However, it would turn out that Reggie's random choice of a lawyer named Christopher Plord would be the second most important decision of his life, right after his decision to kill El Diablo. Because over the course of the next 3 years, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, dressed in his crumpled suits and peering out from behind his wire-rimmed glasses, would make a huge discovery about Reggie that would change everything. And the way Christopher made that discovery was by digging into the murder case that had landed Reggie in Calipatria in the first place. 6 years before the murder of El Diablo, late on the night of Monday, March 28, 1994, 2 LAPD homicide detectives arrived at the scene of a murder. It was right outside of a known house of prostitution on Figueroa Street, the street in South Central that Reggie used to spend a lot of his time on. The victim was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez Angeles. He was found lying on the ground with a gunshot wound in his back. The police located the prostitution house manager, a pimp named John Jones, who also became their star eyewitness. According to John, who saw the attack from the second-floor window of the house, he said Felipe showed up to the house that night in a car with 2 other men. Felipe had gotten out, he had walked up to the door and knocked loudly. When one of John's staff members had opened the door, Felipe had asked to see a specific prostitute, but he was told she was busy. So Felipe turned around and started walking back toward the car where his other 2 friends were. But before he could get to the car, 3 teenagers, 2 of which had guns, appeared out of the darkness and demanded Felipe give them his money. They also yelled at Felipe's 2 friends who were in the car to do the same thing. But Felipe and his friends didn't speak English and just stood there seeming confused. At which point, the teenagers just started shooting at Felipe and his friends in the car. Felipe got hit in the back as he tried to flee, and his friends, they sped off in the car. The teenagers turned and ran down an alley, but before they disappeared, John said he noticed one of them was limping. John figured in the chaos, this teen had gotten accidentally shot in the leg by his own friend or even by himself, potentially. A few weeks after the murder, a tip from police working a different crime altogether would lead those 2 LAPD detectives who arrived at Felipe's murder scene to Reggie Cole and his friend and fellow Crip, Obie Anthony, who were both in jail at the time on charges of suspected carjacking. One of the 2 detectives brought Reggie into an interrogation room, and during the questioning, the detective examined Reggie's legs, and very quickly, he found a gunshot wound. Based on the presence of this gunshot wound on Reggie's leg and the eyewitness testimony of the pimp, John Jones, Reggie and Obie were both found guilty of murdering Felipe Angeles, and they both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. But looking at that case 6 years later, with his client, Reggie, in solitary confinement facing yet another murder charge, all Christopher Plord saw were some very big cracks in the LAPD investigation. Over the next 3 years, Christopher unearthed forensic evidence showing that the bullet that killed Felipe had not been fired from street level, but rather from above, maybe even from the roof or from John Jones's own apartment window. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene that matched Reggie's or Obie's, and no witness could ever identify Reggie as the shooter. John Jones himself had retracted his own testimony, saying that he had told the cops what they wanted to hear in exchange for a lighter sentence when it came to his own crime of running a prostitution house. But by far, the most surprising and damning discovery Christopher made about Reggie's case had to do with the wound on Reggie's leg. It was indeed a gunshot wound. However, it was not anywhere near recent. It was the result of an accident that had happened to Reggie when he was 13 years old, 5 years prior to the murder of Felipe Angeles. And when the LAPD detectives saw this wound in the interrogation room, they would have known it could not possibly have happened recently. It was just a big scar, and Reggie clearly wasn't affected by it. He was not limping at all. In addition to the extremely flimsy case against Reggie for that murder charge, another factor that enhanced the likelihood that Reggie was innocent was Reggie's own behavior after getting convicted. In Calipatria, where violence was power and inmates proudly talked about being killers, Reggie was one of the only inmates who insisted he was not a killer, that he was innocent of his crime. And whenever he wasn't in his cell or working or exercising in the yard, he was spending hours in the prison law library researching wrongful convictions. In February 2008, after Reggie had spent 14 years in prison, 8 of those years in solitary confinement, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, took Reggie's original murder case back to court. And this time, the judge decided that Reggie was innocent, that he had been wrongfully convicted. Following that decision, the state prosecutor agreed to drop the capital murder charge against Reggie in the death of El Diablo. Instead, he reduced the charge to 10 years in solitary confinement for manslaughter, agreeing that in killing El Diablo, Reggie had acted in self-defense. By the time that ruling came down, Reggie had already spent 8 years in solitary, which were counted towards his 10-year solitary sentence. So, 2 long years later, on May 15, 2009, Reggie Cole finished his solitary confinement sentence and walked out of Calipatria State Prison. He was a free man once again. But Reggie was hardly a happy man. Wrongfully imprisoned for a murder he did not commit, Reggie was only cleared and made free again because of a murder he did commit, and this haunts him. After Reggie's friend, Obie Anthony, was also determined to have been wrongfully convicted, he too was released. In October 2012, the city of Los Angeles paid $8.3 million to Obie Anthony, and in January 2017, it paid $5.2 million to Reggie Cole.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.